The lamps in the small house in Utica had been trimmed twice already that evening, and the servants who passed through the inner courtyard moved without speaking because they had been told that the master was reading. In the room beyond the colonnade, Marcus Porcius Cato sat upon a couch with a scroll across his knees, the Phaedo of Plato, that dialogue in which Socrates, on the last day of his life, discusses with his friends whether the soul is immortal and whether a philosopher ought to fear his ending. He had asked, a little while before, that his sword be brought to him, and when his son had refused and the weapon had been quietly removed from the room, Cato had said nothing, only continued reading. But he had asked for the sword a second time, and when the household began to understand that he meant to have it, that no argument would dissuade him, that no embrace from his son and no tears from his freedmen would alter what he had decided in the long hours of that afternoon, a stillness settled over the house in Utica that was not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of a man who had made his peace with the gods and was waiting only for the household to make its peace with him. The civil war was lost, Caesar was coming, and Cato, who had spent 48 years standing for a republic that no longer existed, had determined that he would not live one morning longer as a subject in the city he had refused to surrender. This is the night we shall sit with, not to glorify what he did, not to recommend it, but to understand what he understood and what the Stoics, who took him as their exemplar in the centuries that followed, believed he was teaching by the manner of his ending. The principle is this, that freedom, rightly understood, must include the freedom to consent to one's own ending, that a life which cannot be relinquished is not, in the strictest sense, a life one possesses, and that the wise man, the Stoic teachers held, must keep one door always unbarred, lest he find himself the slave of his own continuation. Epictetus would later put it with characteristic plainness. The door is open, he says in the Discourses. Has the room filled with smoke? If it is moderate, I will remain. If it is excessive, I will go out. For this one must remember and hold fast, that the door is open. He is not speaking of haste. He is not speaking of escape from inconvenience. He is speaking of a final reserve of the will, a last possession that no tyrant and no fortune can take from you, the knowledge that you are here by your own continuing ascent. Seneca, writing to Lucilius nearly a century after Cato's death, returns to the same theme repeatedly, and with Cato always in the background of his thinking. In whatever direction you may turn your eyes, he writes, there lies the means to end your woes. See you that precipice? Down that is the descent to liberty. See you that sea, that river, that well? Liberty sits at the bottom. The lines are harsh, they are meant to be. Seneca is not advising recklessness. He is naming a fact about the human condition that the Stoics held it dishonest to ignore. The world contains many doors. The wise man knows where they are. He does not run toward them, but he is not the prisoner of any room. Now one must consider carefully what is and is not being claimed here. The Stoics did not teach that death was preferable to life. They did not teach that suffering was a sufficient reason to depart. The teaching was almost the opposite of what a modern listener might assume. They held that life was, in the ordinary course of things, a preferred indifferent, something to be chosen, something to be tended, something to be lived through with attention and care. The point of keeping the door open was not to be near the door. The point was that a life held under coercion, a life one could not, in principle, decline, was not the property of the one who lived it. It is this freedom that consents to its own ending, a freedom that includes the recognition of its own limits, a freedom that holds its life as a gift to be honored, not as a possession to be clutched. We are told by Diogenes Laertius that Zeno of Citium, the founder of the Stoa, ended his own life in old age after a small injury that he took as a sign. We are told that Cleanthes, his successor, did the same. The tradition is older than Cato, but Cato gave it its most public form. Cato made the principle visible to Rome, and it is to Cato we now turn. Consider where he was. Utica is a port city on the North African coast, a Phoenician foundation older than Carthage, and in the year 46 before the Common Era, it was the last stronghold of the senatorial party that had fought against Julius Caesar in the Civil War. Pompey was already dead, killed in Egypt 4 years before. Metellus Scipio had been defeated at Thapsus a few weeks earlier. The army of the Republic, what remained of it, was scattering. Caesar was marching north along the coast, and there was no longer any question of resistance in the field. Cato had commanded the garrison at Utica. He was not a great general, and he knew it. He had been a senator, a tribune, a praetor, a man whose authority had always rested on the visible incorruptibility of his person and on his refusal to compromise the forms of the old republic. He had walked through the forum in a black toga in the old fashion, when other senators wore the bleached white that had become customary. He had refused bribes that other men accepted as a matter of course. He had stood, on more than one occasion, alone in the Senate House, speaking against measures that every other voice in Rome had endorsed. Plutarch, who is our principal source for the final days, tells us that Cato's chief concern in his last weeks was not himself, but those who had taken refuge under his protection. He had organized the evacuation of senators and equestrians and their families. He had arranged ships. He had negotiated, where he could, terms for those who would surrender. He had been, by every account, calm. He had walked the walls of Utica in the evening. He had attended to the affairs of the city. He had even, Plutarch notes, given a dinner the night before his death, a philosophical dinner at which the conversation had turned to a Stoic paradox, that only the good man is free and that all the wicked are slaves. One of the company, a peripatetic, had objected. He had argued the position of his school. Cato had, according to Plutarch, grown unusually heated in his reply, his voice rising in a way that made the others understand that something was being decided in him. He had pressed the Stoic doctrine with vehemence. Only the good man is free. Only the wise man possesses himself. All the rest, whatever their stations, are owned by their circumstances, owned by their fears, owned by the men above them in the hierarchy of power. And when the conversation had ended, Cato had retired to his chamber and called for the Phaedo and read it through. And then he had read it through a second time. He was, by the standards of his age, an old man, 48 years, not ancient, but at the upper edge of what Roman public life expected. He had a son who was in the house with him. He had freedmen who loved him. He had philosophers in his entourage, including Demetrius the Peripatetic and Apollonides the Stoic, with whom he had been discussing these very questions for years. What he did not have any longer was a republic. The institutions to which he had given his life had collapsed. the constitution he had defended in every speech, in every vote, in every act of obstruction, and every march through the forum, was about to become a courtesy that one man would extend or withhold as he chose. Caesar had already, by reputation, been merciful to those who surrendered. Cicero had accepted clemency. Many others would accept it in the months to come. The pardon was offered. The pardon was real. And it is precisely the pardon that Cato refused. Not because he feared Caesar would betray it. He had no reason to think so. He refused it because he understood that to live by the pardon was to live by the giver of the pardon. And the giver of the pardon was a man, a single man, who had appointed himself the arbiter of who in Rome would breathe and who would not. To accept his life from such a hand was, in Cato's understanding, to acknowledge that such a hand had the right to dispose of it, and this Cato would not do. Plutarch tells us that he said as much, directly, to those around him. I am not willing to be indebted to the tyrant for his illegal acts. He acts contrary to the laws when he saves, as if he were master, those over whom he has no right at all to be lord. Mark that sentence. He acts contrary to the laws when he saves. To be pardoned, Cato is saying, is to participate in the legitimacy of the one who pardons. To accept clemency is to acknowledge that there is a power above the law from which clemency descends, and there ought not to be such a power. And if such a power existed, it ought not to be obeyed, even when it offered life. This is the structure of Cato's refusal. It is not despair. It is not melodrama. It is the logical extension of a position he had held for his entire adult career. He had said all his life that the law was sovereign and no man was above it. Caesar was now above it. And the only way to refuse to ratify Caesar's elevation, when one could no longer resist it with arms, was to refuse the gift Caesar offered, the gift that only a man above the law could bestow. So let us return to the room. The lamps are lit. The Phaedo is on his knees. He has finished it once and begun it again. At some point, he reaches for the sword that hangs above his couch. It is not there. His son has had it removed. Cato understands at once. He says nothing of consequence to the slave who waits in the chamber, but his color changes, and the slave goes out. And presently, the household begins to gather, and his son begins to weep, and his freedmen begin to beg him. And the philosophers who are in the house, Demetrius and Apollonides, are summoned to reason with him. He reasons back. Plutarch preserves the exchange in something close to its philosophical substance. Cato asks them whether they have come to argue him out of his judgment. He asks whether they propose to bind him, an old man, and hold him by force and prevent him from doing what he has determined to do. He says that if they have arguments to offer against his conclusion, let them offer them in the morning when he can hear them as a man should hear them. But the sword, he says, must be returned to him. To take it from him is not to save him. It is only to render him helpless, and to render an old man helpless against his own household on the eve of a tyrant's arrival is to add insult to what has already been determined. The sword is returned. He sleeps, by some accounts. By others, he reads further into the night. We do not know with certainty. What we know is that when the household was finally still, in the hour before dawn, he took the sword and struck himself once below the chest. The wound was not immediately fatal. A physician was called. The wound was bound. Cato woke, found the bandages, understood what had been done, and tore them away with his own hands. And so he died, in the small hours of the morning, in a port city on the African coast, in the year that Caesar became master of Rome. Now, what do we draw from this? We are not asked to admire the act. The Stoic tradition itself was careful here. Seneca writes of Cato with reverence, and yet Seneca, when his own end came to it under different circumstances and would not have urged anyone to imitate Cato's particular choice. The principle that the door is open does not mean that the door ought to be used. The whole weight of Stoic teaching falls on the other side, that life is to be lived, that the present moment is to be inhabited, that the work of philosophy is to make a soul fit to remain in the world. The lesson Cato leaves is more austere and more specific. It is this, that there is a kind of freedom which is not the freedom to do what one wants, and not the freedom to escape what one suffers, but the freedom to refuse to ratify what one judges to be wrong, even at the cost of one's continuation. The Stoics called this the freedom of the wise. They held that it was the only freedom that could not be taken from a man by any external power, because it rested entirely upon his own assent. And assent was the one operation of the soul that no chain and no threat could compel. You may consider this in lesser cases. You almost certainly will not face Cato's situation. You will not, we may reasonably hope, ever stand in a city about to fall, with a tyrant's pardon being extended to you. But you will, in the course of an ordinary life, encounter many smaller versions of the same structure. You will be offered things in exchange for an assent you should not give. You will be offered safety in exchange for a silence. You will be offered comfort in exchange for a complicity. You will be offered continuance of some condition you have grown used to, in exchange for some small interior surrender. And in every such case, the question Cato puts to you across 2,000 years is the same. Are you the kind of being who can decline? Not in the trivial sense of refusing a bargain you do not want. In the deep sense, have you preserved somewhere within yourself the capacity to say no to a thing that the whole weight of circumstance is pressing you to accept? Is there a door in your soul that is open? If there is not, then whatever you call your life, it is not, in the strictest Stoic sense, yours. You are inhabiting a room that has been locked from the outside. You may be comfortable in it. You may be even happy in it, but you are not free in it. And what the Stoics taught, what Cato made visible by the manner of his ending, was that freedom in this strict sense was the foundation of every other virtue, because every other virtue requires that one be able, at the limit, to refuse. This is why Cato became, for the Stoa, the central figure of the Roman period. Not because he was wise in every action. He was, by many accounts, severe to the point of harshness. He was politically inflexible in ways that may have hastened the very collapse he sought to prevent. He held slaves, like every Roman of his class, and his household economy rested on their labor. The tradition does not pretend otherwise. Seneca acknowledges his hardness. Plutarch records the criticisms made of him in his own lifetime. The figure of Cato is not offered as a man without faults. He is offered as a man who, at the final test, demonstrated that a human being is capable of holding something more precious than his own continuation. And what he held more precious was not glory, and not posterity, and not even principle in the abstract. It was very specifically his own non-participation in an order he judged illegitimate. He would not give Caesar the gift of his life, because to receive that gift would have been to give Caesar, in return, the acknowledgement that Caesar had the right to bestow it, the freedom that consents to its own ending. Mark the word consents. It is not the freedom that seeks its own ending. It is not the freedom that welcomes its ending. It is the freedom that, when ending is the price of refusal, can pay that price without flinching. It is a reserve. It is a last room in the interior of the soul, which the wise man keeps furnished and ready, not because he plans to retreat to it, but because the existence of that room is what makes every other room habitable. You see the structure now. The Stoic does not live with one foot out the door. He lives fully in his life. He tends to his duties, he honors his relationships, he serves the city, he takes pleasure in the things that are properly pleasurable. But underneath all of this, at the foundation, there is an assent. He is here because he continues to assent to being here. And the moment he could not, in conscience, give that assent, he would not be coerced into pretending he had given it. This is what the open door means. This is what Cato made visible. Let us close with this. You are not Cato. You will not, in any likelihood, face his choice. The Stoics themselves did not teach that you should seek to face it. They taught the opposite. They taught that the work of a life is to inhabit it well, to extend it usefully, to make of it something that serves the common reason of which each of us is a small, participating part. But the question Cato leaves you with is not whether you would die for what you believe. That is a question for legends, and most of us are not legends, and the Stoics were suspicious of the theatrical. The question is smaller and harder, and asked of you on ordinary days. It is this: what, in your present life, are you continuing to assent to that you have not actually examined? What rooms are you living in that you have never tested the doors of? What conditions of your existence have you accepted simply because they were given to you, and never asked whether, on reflection, you would choose them again? The door is open, Epictetus says. He does not mean that you should leave. He means that you should know it is open. He means that the knowledge of the open door changes the meaning of remaining in the room. If you stay because you cannot leave, you are a prisoner, whatever the room contains. If you stay because, knowing you could leave, you have chosen to remain, then the same room becomes a chosen dwelling, and the same life becomes a life you possess, rather than a life that possesses you. This is what Cato understood in the small house in Utica on the night before Caesar arrived. He had been offered a room with the door bolted from outside. He had been offered safety on terms that required him to forget that the door had ever been his to open. And he had answered, in the only way that remained to him, that he was not the kind of being to whom such an offer could be made. Carry the question with you, not as a burden, as a quiet companion. Where in your life is the door? And have you remembered that it is open? And are you remaining where you are because you have chosen to, or because you have forgotten that choosing was ever possible? The wise man, we are told, keeps one door always unbarred. Tend to yours.